So let's take a look at Samantha. Here we have Samantha. She's a 13-year-old student in an inclusive classroom. She's been coming home crying for the past week. Through discussion with Samantha and classroom observation, you see that some of the students take great fun in watching Samantha squirm as they lightly touch her, and the parent hope that Samantha will eventually strike out and get blamed for starting a fight. So previous to today, you would have talked to Samantha's teacher, you would have talked about how other students are bullying her, but now you're part of her team, and you realize it's her turn to work on self-advocacy. So what stage might Samantha be? What stage would you guess? Yeah, I would guess stage 1. Well, pretty close to it, because it seems like she hasn't advocated for herself yet. After you start working with her, you might find that she's at a later stage, but you're going to at least start out with stage 1. And what's this going to look like? How are you going to work with Samantha so that she can learn to advocate for herself? Okay, so what can she do about it? It means having a conversation with her, very much like I talked about with Sammy earlier. What can we do about it? And some of the options might be ignore the bullies, maybe punch the bullies in the nose. Now, what's wrong with those two suggestions? It doesn't solve the problem, says somebody over here. And those are common suggestions. But they don't solve the problem because bullying involves an imbalance of power. The bully's having most of the power, the person who's being bullied has less or no power. And what you're asking to do in those two suggestions is the person with the least amount of power to do most of the work, to have most of the responsibility. Well, really, the responsibility lies with who? It lies with the adults in the situation. So you would eventually get to having Samantha move her seat, talking to the teacher. And somebody also needs to talk to the bullies as well. So developing an advocacy plan. That was that 3-step process I talked about a little bit earlier. Now, when I was talking about the 3-step process for developing an advocacy plan, the first step is called scanning the environment. The question is, where is the challenge? And the challenge can show up in any one of these 3 areas. Sometimes there's more than one of them going on at once. So what is the perception of the environment? Cognitive has to do with how we think. Socio-emotional has to do with reading social cues and how we feel. So once we find the challenge, and we'll talk about some possible challenges later, we engage in advocacy. So in other words, explaining your needs in a way that somebody else can understand. And the disclosure aspect, giving the reason why. So let's take an example. I teach a course in computers at the university level. Is it appropriate for me to disclose that I have Asperger's syndrome? How many people vote no? How many people vote yes? All right, so we get some of each. Now, when we think about disclosure, deciding whether to disclose, deciding whether to advocate, there's a question to be answered. And that question is, does the effect of having autism significantly impact this relationship or situation? And is there a need for better mutual understanding? And I see some people shaking their head like this. So that means no. So I wouldn't tell my computer class because it doesn't significantly impact the relationship I have with my students. But as I consider my class and how I teach my class, I also realized that, like many of us on the autism spectrum, I have difficulty with facial recognition. So it's hard for me to remember who my students are. It actually takes me all semester to begin to figure out who they are. So what I've done is I've nailed a cognitive challenge, a difference in the way we think, a cognitive challenge. People with autism have difficulty remembering faces. That's because people with autism process faces where most people process objects. The fusiform gyrus of the brain. So when you look at an object, the fusiform gyrus lights up. But for those of us on the spectrum, when you look at faces, as a typical person, an area of the brain called the fusiform face gyrus lights up. So you got these two parts. Now for those of us on the autism spectrum, the object recognition, that works out pretty well. The facial recognition gets rerouted to the fusiform gyrus, to where objects are recognized. And the object area of the brain just isn't as good at recognizing faces as the fusiform gyrus is. So, does not recognizing my students significantly impact my relationship with my class? Yeah, I would guess. I would say that it does. So what I might do is advocate to my students like this. You know, I'm really bad at remembering faces. So sometimes the disclosure comes first. I'm really bad at remembering faces, so it would be helpful to me is if you see me out of class and it looks like I don't recognize you, it means I don't. So it would be helpful to me if you reintroduced yourself to me outside of class. And so that's the advocacy. And I did it in a way that they could understand and they could appreciate. I did what is known as a partial disclosure. I noticed the specific aspect of autism that's getting in the way, not the whole thing. It wouldn't be appropriate to disclose the whole thing. Now let us suppose that I did that little disclosure thing, and at the end of the class, somebody comes up to me and says, gee, this is really interesting. I have a brother with Asperger's syndrome, and you know what? He doesn't even recognize me, and I'm his sister. Would it be appropriate to go into a further disclosure with that person? Yeah, I would say that it probably is, because that person understands the situation, has a better understanding of the situation than somebody else might. And in that case, it might be appropriate. So, taking a look at this further, developing an advocacy plan. I come into a room, and I notice it's lit with fluorescent lights. Maybe I'll ask the instructor to change, if they could change the lighting. Or if it's a work situation, I might ask my supervisor. Now thinking back to the individual education plan, this is where involvement is really helpful. And maybe that student, that now adult, could have a flashback. Thinking back to 3rd grade, gee, you know, I remember having a lot of trouble with the fluorescent light. It was right above my head. And I remember when my teacher, Mrs. Johnson, we tried a lot of things. First, she let me wear a hat, but that didn't really work. So then we tried some other things, and that didn't work either. So finally, I remember she stood up on the desk, and I thought it was pretty funny because she almost fell off. And she unscrewed the light from the fixture. And then everything was fine because enough light came in from the window. And that gets fast-forwarded. Gee, you know, I may have to shut off these lights, but I get enough light from the window. Or maybe I could bring in my own incandescent lamp. So that's why getting involved in the education plan is so important. And I would leave it as a partial disclosure. Now, what about remembering things? How many of you are good at remembering long strings of information? You're lost. You go into a convenience store. Ask for directions. There's 10 steps to the directions. So what do? You write it down. You say, whoa, wait a minute, I got to write this down. You have a piece of paper, and you do it. And that was an act of self-advocacy. You didn't think twice about it, and it's done. But for us on the autism spectrum, this may require direct instruction, teaching people on the spectrum when that needs to be done. So the person on the spectrum could say, for example, let's call it a work environment. let's call it a work environment, and let us say, you know, I'll be much more productive for you if I have a chance to write down these instructions. So part of the disclosure or the advocacy is describing the benefit for the other person. I'll be much more productive for you if you give me a chance to write these instructions. Could you repeat them? Or could I have a look at the manual so I can copy down the instructions myself? Or a real slick maneuver is to say, gee, could you email me those directions? And then it's already written. Or you could request an instructor for written instructions or a copy of their notes. Again, going partial is probably the best way to go about it. A lot of times, probably most of the time, a partial disclosure is better. Disclosure should be done on an as need to know basis. You don't need to tell everybody that you're on the autism spectrum. Says me, who has told everybody, wrote a book. But not everybody has read my book. So it works out. Socio-emotional. Well, gee, you know, I hear a lot of laughter going on. I know you're telling jokes, but, you know, I tend to be a pretty serious kind of guy and don't always know when someone's making a joke. So if you could let me in on it, that would be very helpful. At age 8, I'd spend hours cracking open small rocks with a big rock. I was fascinated with the shiny specks inside and the sharp edges. Cracking open those rocks eventually grew into a special interest in geology, geography, and many others. And I remember about this age, I had this big stack of astronomy books on my desk, busy taking notes and copying diagrams. And a teacher came up to me and said, you know, you'll never learn how to do math. But somehow I figured out just enough math to teach statistics at the university level. But just a little bit. The good news today is that an educator would realize this, would realize what is going on, and find a way to use that special interest as a motivator for teaching curriculum.